I want to start it off with this question is freedom fighters. Can you explain what is freedom fighters and how did this coincide with the Hebrew Israelites in today's time? Freedom fighters.
Mhm. Well, as always, first giving all honor and praises to the Holy One of Israel, to Yahweh, God of the Israelites, and to the Anointed, all through the ages, including in this dispensation of time, whom we recognize as Ben-Ami HaMashiach, and to all those that are in search of truth, justice, peace, mercy, love. On this plane of our existence, I greet you and your audience in peace. Shalom Aleichem.
Shalom.
Well, to speak of freedom fighters, you generally think of war and guerrilla warfare and all-out fight for a people's control of their destiny. And our struggle is no different in that we are engaged in a spiritual war. We've long since realized that we can't win this war via political means. We can't win this war via economic means, because at its root, our predicament is not a political or an economic situation. Our solution has to be spiritual, because our problem is spiritual. It is connected intrinsically and inseparably to our relationship with the Most High. And it is for that reason and that reason alone that we are in this predicament, because of our terrible relationship with the Most High. So when you read about the children of Israel and you read all those adjectives that precede their names, you know, it's wicked, sinful, stubborn, backsliding, hard-headed, stiff-necked, evil, sinful, etc., etc. Well, if these are your children, and if you've got children, you'll know what I'm talking about. There's a limit and boundary to what you will allow. And so we know that our situation was one that is one around the world globally, that we are suffering because of that relationship, that poor relationship, those consequences of that disobedience. And so we waged war literally against the Creator, and we've lost as a result. And so we had to gain back that relationship, and in doing so, then we could emerge truly free, because our freedom has to be tied to our purpose. We're not just here willy-nilly to do what we want to do. We have a purpose and a mission. And as Israelites, we are to be a light unto the nations. That is why the world is in such great darkness, because we abdicated our responsibility on that wise. And so, you know, being a freedom fighter in that context and being a freedom fighter in 2023, we look at situations like in Burkina Faso, and the countenance on that brother, who certainly, I've talked to people who said he's the image of Thomas Sankara, you know, who 3 decades ago was assassinated by his friend and comrade in a revolutionary struggle. You know, they were freedom fighters, comrades in arms, and his own friend took him out. So we look at those struggles, we look at those emerging military leaders who stood up now and want to throw off the yoke of neo-colonialism. But we know at the root of it that if they're not protected by the Most High, if they don't embrace and bring close to them the Most High via their pursuits, their interests being aligned with the interests of Yah also, it won't work. It won't work. They won't have the protection. They won't. We have to bring the Creator into our struggle. We have to invoke His help into our struggle, and the only way we're going to do that is make sure that our objectives are in alignment with His objectives. Other than that, He has no reason to fight for us. And at this point, we need nothing less than the divine intervention of God or Yah into our affairs.
I agree. Okay. All right. Ahmadiel, you mentioned about Israelites. Can you explain to the viewers, according to you, who are the true Israelites?
Well, if we were to, I'm laughing and thinking about this past year, and the controversy surrounding Kyrie Irving and Ye, formerly, what was his
Kanye
name?
West.
Kanye West,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
The controversy that they caused and that they stepped in. They stepped in a minefield, and this is one of those types of questions. But we can meet it head on, and we just have to be truthful. And there's a language that we can use to make sure that it's not. It can't be challenged because it's simply the truth. And so when you look at the history of the Israelites and you look at the dispersion of the Israelites, again, it was due to their disobedience that Moses pronounced that they would be dispersed, they would be scattered. This is in the 28th chapter of Deuteronomy. And I know that there are Jewish naysayers and so forth that want to make different interpretations of Deuteronomy 28 and the various curses that are found within it that would befall the children of Israel, but that you can't collectively dismiss those curses and our prophetic reality. They fit hand in glove relative to the identity of the people and the people who came forth from those that Moses was speaking to. Those are our ancestors, and we hands down we can show the lineage and how it all connects up. But if you look at the fact that in the dispersion at the hands of the Romans in the year 70, that the Romans were a oppressive military power coming from the north. Which way would Israelites flee when their culture was smashed, when Jerusalem was ransacked? Which way would they run as they became refugees? Would they run to the north? That doesn't make common military sense. You would flee in a opposite direction. You would also flee in a direction that was familiar to you. Israelites were quite familiar. The Hebrew family was quite familiar with Egypt and Ethiopia. Those countries are mentioned more than 1,500 times in the scriptures. And so that whole history of Joseph and his brethren, and Moses, of course, coming out of Egypt, that we would have fled in that direction. And when you begin to look at the migration patterns of many African peoples, African ethnic groups, they actually have a heritage and a history and oral narratives and traditions that point to Northeast Africa, where we sit today. This is Northeast Africa. Geologically and geographically, this is Northeast Africa. And so that migration pattern is documented even by UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. The paths that led them down into West Africa. The Sign and the Seal, a book by Graham Hancock, documents the movement of the Ark of the Covenant up the Nile River, as if the Ark floated itself up the Nile River. No, people carried it up the Nile River. Who were those people? They were Israelites. And so it's without question that we have a heritage that links us back to the land of Israel. Many of us who ended up in West Africa didn't stay there. We couldn't remain there. We had a date with destiny to get on those ships of Deuteronomy, the 28th chapter and the 68th verse, that carried us into a land of captivity where we would be sold as male and female slaves, and no man would redeem us, for us to get out of that captivity. That's a very unique history for a people to have befallen a people, and I know of no other people whose history brings them into a land of captivity by way of ships. And so when you look at and I'm not just talking about we being the Africans who ended up in the Western Hemisphere, but the Africans who even remained in Africa. When you read Nehemiah, the 9th chapter, and starting around the 29th verse, it speaks of the land that God gave to us, this rich and bountiful land, and then it goes on and it says, we were servants in it. We are servants in it this day. And so when you look at Niger and its uranium, how could a land so wealthy be so poor? How could a continent so wealthy have the poorest people? It doesn't fit. And so when you look at the Lemba, down in South Africa, northern South Africa, southern Zimbabwe, when you look at the Ashanti in West Africa, and the Ga in West Africa, and the Igbo in Nigeria, you look at the Bassa Bantu in Cameroon at the curve in Africa there. These are people whose heritages, whose oral narratives, whose traditions are mosaic. Separation of women during their menstrual cycle and after childbirth, circumcision of the boys on the 8th day, linguistic connections that parallel Hebrew and names and what have you, songs and there's no denying of these things, and European anthropologists know these things as well. I mean, this is nothing that's new on the scene like that. This is something that has been documented over the ages, and it's been suppressed. It's been suppressed. So we know, and ultimately we know, again, Israel has a mission and a purpose. And I'll say this, getting back to that original controversy that was stirred up. In our view, when you read, for example, in the book of Revelation, 2nd chapter, 9th verse, those who say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan, we have to be very careful, because this is not about genetics. This is not about race. This is not about DNA. If it was, we would be looking for Chaldean ancestry to look at Abraham's roots. What made Abraham the first Hebrew? If, again, we would be looking for Chaldean roots if it was about the bloodlines. And so what I'm saying is that if we who claim that lineage and can actually prove, and follow those lineages and those threads of our cultural continuity back through West Africa, across the Atlantic, back to West Africa, and across Africa back here to Northeast Africa, that's great and that's fine. But if we are not doing what Israel was supposed to do, if we're not being that light unto the nations, if we are not bringing the blessings to the rest of the nations that was going to be the heritage of Abraham's seed, then what good are we? And we then fall into that same category of saying we are Judeans, saying we are Israelites, saying we are Hebrews, but we're not either if we're not doing the works. So we have to be very careful, because the prophet Isaiah made it very clear that a stranger can get a name and a place, a place, chosen people, greater than of sons and daughters. So that is something that should keep any of us humble who are laying claim to this Hebraic, Judean, Israelite identity. I don't care what the color or the ancestry is. There's a purpose that we are to fulfill, and that's where we need to be focused on.
Okay. So that's well put. Now, you mentioned it's a purpose that need to be focused on. So now, us being Hebrew Israelites, now, do you explain to the people, to the viewers, how are we going to make the spiritual change in this world? How are we going to bring peace to the Middle East? How are we going to bring peace to the world as Hebrew Israelites? How are we going to do this?
Well, one of the ways is that we have to focus on truth. We are a people of truth. It's written, it says that Israel for a long time had been without a teaching priest, without law, and without the true God. Well, that's what it says in the English. But actually in the Hebrew, it's a little different. It's not the true God. It's the God of truth. Elohe ha-emet. And of course, if you want to use, that's in an Old Testament, Hebraic Testament reference. Of course, in a Greek Testament, New Testament reference, you have Yeshua quoted as saying, "Ye shall know the truth. Truth will make you free." So there's a direct link between our relationship with God and being truthful. Being purveyors of truth. Truth, like it's written, has been cast into the street. I think it was Isaiah said, truth has been cast into the gutter, kicked to the curb. So we have to embrace truth and make it dear to us. And one of the things that Ben Mashiach left us with was a reverence for truth. He would always say that there is nothing more sacred than truth. And so wherever we find it, the next question for us is, where does it fit in our 24/7 reality here, that lifestyle? If it's a keystone, sometimes in your rebuilding the structure, if it's a keystone, you know sometimes, wait a minute, this has to be set to the side because this is the last thing you put in the arch. But we look for the rest of the pieces to get up to that point. And so that's how we've built this culture, and that's how we've garnered the favor of the Most High that has protected us all these years. But we know that truth is essential in being able to pave the way towards where we have to be. First of all, when you speak of peace and segueing on that idea of truth, when you say peace in the Middle East, the first thing we have to come to grips with is that what do you mean Middle East? What is the Middle East? Where is that? Mm-hmm. The Middle East is actually a figment of Eurocentric imagination. Mm-hmm. The Middle East was simply a term that the British applied to this region, and it made sense geopolitically in their world as they were leaving the center of their world in London, heading east when they got to Japan and Korea and China. It made sense to call that the Far East. And they passed through this region here on their way to the Far East. So it makes sense only in that context. Other than that, where's Upper East? Is there a Lower East? What do you mean Middle East? Middle of whose East? And so when you look at who coined the term, then you get the key to it. And so we who are embracing this new idea, we who are the pioneers and redefiners of a new world order, we have seized the power to define and say, no, this is Northeast Africa. And geologically, that's correct. Mm-hmm. No geologist would dispute that. We're sitting on the African tectonic plate. Hebrew is an African language. Mm-hmm. No linguist would dispute that. And so we're just insisting on truth. But when you then go from that point to making peace, mm-hmm. I'll give you the simple equation that you find in the word shalom, peace. Hebrew, everybody knows when you say shalom, it's peace. But shalom is built on two other Hebraic words. One being shlemut. At the foundation, shlemut. You hear the same sh, L, and M sounds there. The root is the same. Shlemut, however, means integrity. Mm-hmm. And integrity is your yea is yea and your nay is nay. And I can go to sleep on that. You know, when Bilal says he's going to be there or he's going to do this, we rest with that. You know, because he's a man of his word. We take you at your word. And we know if something's happening and going to adjust that, hey, he's going to reach out and say, hey, I'm not going to be able to make that, or I won't be able to fulfill that. And so that's integrity that has to be in place between men and women and nations and peoples. Mm-hmm. And so when you have integrity, then you have the next level, which is in Hebrew, shalom. And shalom is perfection, oneness, and wholeness. And so you might remember that, I think it was Zenith or one of the Motorola or something, they had what was called the integrated circuit. You know, instead of the transistor tubes and the literal glass tubes that were in your TV sets and what have you, they came up with an integrated circuit, and it was all welded and fused together. Again, integrity, integer, oneness, wholeness. That it was shalom, it was perfect, it was all on one motherboard, you know. And so that became the next level. And then, only then, after you have that wholeness and oneness, that fusion of ideas and people and commitments and purpose, then you get to shalom. Mm-hmm. So to put that in the context of this region and all this talk about peace, mm-hmm. well, America is supposed to be the peace broker. Even Russia and China trying to get in on the deal, and France, and everybody wants to be at the table brokering the peace. You had a Camp David Accord. And in 76, 77, you know, they met. Egypt and Israel forged peace. Saudi Arabia was part of the deal. And everybody shook hands in Washington, you know, and made peace. And the brother who, Anwar Sadat, president of Egypt, was assassinated not long after that. Of course, he was a brother. He was a dark-skinned Egyptian. that's another whole issue. We could talk about Netflix and the Cleopatra controversy. But when the peace deal was ended, a few weeks later, then the announcements made. Israel gets $3 billion of weapons every year. Egypt gets 2.5 million weapons every year, jet fighter planes, tanks, and what have you. And Saudi Arabia, they get $1.8 million every year. $1 billion every year. And you realize that, wait a minute, I thought it was a peace talk. But if you see two brethren in the neighborhood fighting, one's got a knife and the other one's got a stick, you don't take the stick and give them a hatchet and give the other one a Uzi, and say now continue, now balance of power, they like to call it. That's warmongering. That's war. That's all that could be attributed to. That's not peace. Give me that stick. Give me that knife. Go stand in the corner. That's what real peacemakers would do if they were sincere about bringing the peace. But we all know, again, going back to that fundamental idea of integrity, that the foundation of the idea of shalom, integrity, shlemut, that if you don't have integrity, if your female and male diplomats moving around the world aren't telling the truth, they're not men and women of integrity, it's impossible to have